You wake up at 6:47, not because you chose to, because your body learned 43 years ago that 6:47 is when the day begins, and now your nervous system doesn't ask permission anymore. The alarm is already off before your eyes open. You've trained yourself so well that the training no longer feels like training. You shower, you dress, you leave the house at 7:32 because you've calculated that 7:32 gets you to the office by 8:14, which gives you 16 minutes to buy coffee and pretend you're not already tired. This is not a life you're living. This is a schedule you're executing. By 9 a.m., you've already traded 2 hours of your existence for money you will not see for another 2 weeks. You don't think about it in those terms because thinking about it in those terms would create a cognitive dissonance your mind cannot afford. So instead, you think about the email you need to send, the meeting at 10:30, the lunch you'll eat at your desk because stopping to eat would mean admitting that you're a body, not a function. This is the rat race, not metaphorically, structurally. Sociologist C. Wright Mills documented this in 1951 in his book White Collar, describing a system where the middle class was no longer defined by ownership but by dependency, a shift so complete that most people stopped recognizing it as a system at all. Source: C. Wright Mills, White Collar, 1951. They began calling it normal. They began calling it life. And the system, which had no consciousness and no malice, simply continued operating because systems don't need malice to function. They only need compliance. Here's what the system requires from you: a salary that arrives predictably, expenses that rise to meet that salary, a sense of security so fragile that the thought of losing the paycheck creates genuine panic, and a psychological architecture where work is not something you do, but something you are. You don't have a job, you are employed. The distinction is not semantic. It's the difference between owning an action and being owned by one. The numbers are stark. Roughly 4.2 billion people globally wake up and trade hours for paychecks they will spend before the next cycle begins. Source: International Labor Organization, Global Employment Trends, 2024. In the United States alone, the average worker spends 90,000 hours of their life at work. Source: Bureau of Labor Statistics, American Time Use Survey, 2023. That's more than 10 years of continuous time, not 10 years of work-life balance. 10 years of 8-hour blocks, 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year, from age 22 to age 65, and most of those workers will retire with less than $100,000 in savings. Source: Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances 2022. The trap is not that work exists. The trap is the specific structure. You trade time for money, and the money you receive is precisely calibrated to keep you dependent on the next paycheck. You earn for $200 a month. Your rent is $1,600. Your car payment is $380. Your insurance, utilities, groceries, and subscriptions total $1,240. You have $980 left. Out of that $980, you spend $420 on discretionary purchases, coffee, dinner out, a streaming service you forgot you had. You save $560. At that rate, you will accumulate $6,120 per year. Source: Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances 2022. Do the math forward. 40 years of $6,720 per year is $268,800. That sounds substantial until you account for inflation, which will have eroded that $268,800 into roughly $89,600 in today's purchasing power. Source: U.S. Inflation Calculator, Bureau of Labor Statistics 2024. You will have traded 40 years of your life for the equivalent of 2 years of current income, and you will have called it retirement. But here's the structural part that most people never examine. The system is not designed to make you poor, it's designed to make you dependent. There's a difference. You can be dependent on a 6-figure salary, you can be dependent on a 7-figure net worth. The trap is not the amount of money, the trap is the relationship to the money. When you escape, and we'll get to what that actually means, the first thing that breaks is the psychological architecture. You've spent decades being told that your value is your salary, that your security is your job title, that your identity is your role. You are a software engineer. You are a marketing manager. You are a sales director. Remove the job, and there's a silence where the identity used to be. That silence is terrifying to most people. It's not the loss of income that causes the panic. It's the loss of the structure that told you who you were. This is why studies on early retirement consistently show that the hardest part isn't the money. The hardest part is the rewiring. Researchers at Boston College found that retirees who had not prepared psychologically for retirement, who had not built an identity outside of work, experienced depression, anxiety, and a sense of purposelessness within 6 months of leaving their jobs. Source: Boston College Center for Retirement Research, The Unexpected Retirement, 2021. The ones who made it through were the ones who had already begun the rewiring while still employed. They had built something outside the job, a skill, a business, a community, a sense of purpose that didn't depend on a paycheck. The second structural requirement for escape is the savings threshold, not a specific number that varies by location, by lifestyle, by risk tolerance, but a threshold where your passive income exceeds your expenses. This is not theoretical. This is the 4% rule, derived from the Trinity study of 1998, which analyzed historical market data and determined that if you withdraw 4% of your invested portfolio annually, you have a 95% probability of not running out of money over a 30-year retirement. Source: Trinity Study 1998. The math is simple. If you spend $40,000 per year, you need $1,000 in invested assets. If you spend $60,000 per year, you need $1,500,000. If you spend $100,000 per year, you need $2,500,000. The Northwestern Mutual Planning Study found that the average American believes they need $146 million to retire comfortably. Source: Northwestern Mutual Planning Study 2026. Most of them will never accumulate that amount. Most of them will not even try. And here's the uncomfortable part. Whether you escape or not is not primarily a function of your intelligence, your work ethic, or your virtue. It's a function of the gap between your income and your expenses, multiplied by the number of years you're willing to delay gratification, divided by your access to financial knowledge and investment vehicles. It's a formula, and most people are not positioned to solve it. You grew up in a system that taught you to consume. Advertising reached you 4,000 to 10,000 times per day by the time you were 18. Source: Journal of Advertising Research 2020. Your parents, if they were middle class, modeled consumption as the primary form of self-expression and stress relief. You learned that when you felt bad, you bought something. When you succeeded, you celebrated by spending. The system was not teaching you to accumulate. It was teaching you to circulate money back into the system as quickly as it reached your hands. Then, at some point, maybe at 28, maybe at 35, maybe at 42, you realized that the schedule was not temporary, that you were not building towards something, that you were executing the same loop over and over and the loop had no exit. That's the moment when escape becomes possible, not because you suddenly became smarter or more disciplined, but because the cognitive dissonance became too loud to ignore. The escape itself has 3 phases. The first is the structural phase. You calculate the number, you determine what your expenses actually are, not what you think they are, but what they demonstrably are, tracked to the dollar for 3 months. You calculate how much you need to accumulate. You determine the gap between your current savings rate and the savings rate required to reach that number in a time frame you can tolerate. This phase is purely mathematical. It takes about 4 weeks. The second phase is the psychological phase. You begin to rewire your identity. You stop thinking of yourself as an employee and start thinking of yourself as someone building something. You start reading about investing. You start thinking about what you would do with your time if you didn't have to work. You start building skills that don't depend on your job. You start having conversations with people who have already escaped. You begin to construct a version of yourself that exists independently of your paycheck. This phase takes months. For some people, it takes years. The third phase is the execution phase. You actually do the thing. You increase your savings rate, you automate your investments, you watch the number grow, you resist the urge to upgrade your lifestyle every time your salary increases. You say no to purchases that don't align with your vision. You say no to opportunities that would require you to trade more time for money. You become boring to people who are still in the loop. They will not understand. They will think you're being cheap or paranoid or that you've joined a cult. You continue anyway, and then one day, maybe after 5 years, maybe after 10, maybe after 15, you wake up and the math has changed. Your passive income exceeds your expenses. You no longer have to work. You can, if you want. But you don't have to. The difference is absolute. What happens next is the part that nobody talks about. The first 6 months are euphoria. You've won. You've escaped the system that was designed to keep you dependent. You have time. You have freedom. You have choice. Then something shifts. The euphoria fades. And you're left with the silence we talked about earlier. the silence where your identity used to be, and you realize that escaping the rat race was the easy part. The hard part is figuring out what you're running toward, not just what you're running away from. But that's a different conversation. For now, the point is this. You escaped because you understood something that most people never do. That the system is not malevolent, it's just a system. And systems can be navigated, optimized, and eventually exited. Most people never make it out because they never decide to. Not because they're incapable, not because they're lazy, but because the system is designed to make the decision invisible. It makes dependency feel like choice. It makes the loop feel like life. You saw through it. That's why you're not waking up at 6:47 anymore.